Hello, welcome to another episode of Tales and Tactics, Rules as Written. This is the show that gives tabletop games the book club treatment. Join us as we dive deep into games you know or may never have heard of. I'm your host, Troy. Joining me is my co-host, Max, and with us behind the scenes is our producer, Jay. Today's episode is War of the Ring, 2nd edition. This is an epic strategy board game where players, that'd be you, take on the role of the free people resisting the forces of darkness, the shadow coming from Mordor.
This is the 2nd edition of this version of the game, if I'm correct. And it's sort of like a spiritual sequel to the 1977 SPI game of the same name, which is obviously more crunchy, having it be like a hex and counter game, whereas this is more of like a territory control game.
Yeah, exactly. Like the SPI game was a war game in the literal sense of the word, in that it's like a hex grid of Middle-earth. It is cardboard square counters with, like your 4-3-1, you know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
Right? And that would represent like your units, and they have step losses. Like it's the whole thing. This game takes a lot of the theming of Lord of the Rings and puts it to the fore, sort of taking the mechanics and making them closer to the thematic intent of the game, whereas the SPI game was a really excellent war game that could produce really great Lord of the Rings outcomes, or it could also just turn into a battle of whatever.
Yeah, I think the SPI game is more loose, even though it has the same elements, those being there's a war game happening, and then you have your journey of the fellowship, and that's kind of your trump card that'll like tip the balance. You're right. It's so open-ended. It could probably turn into like a whole bunch of different outcomes. This version is much more controlled. I jokingly refer to it as Risk meets Candyland. That sounds disparaging. It seems like it's a lot better than that.
Well, what I think this game manages to do that's really successful is it takes a strategy board game, with territory control, army movement. It takes that, and then it adds 2 additional layers that really matter to this game. The first of that is what we've already mentioned, the fellowship phase. That is where you're going to be moving Frodo and co. across Middle-earth, trying to run the touchdown of the ring to Mount Doom. And then this third heat is the presence of the characters.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of strategy games tend to have army movement, where you're moving around your distinct character units, like a spearman, a swordsman, cavalry, whatever. But they stop at having personalities because of the grand strategy level of command. In War of the Ring here, because this is so intimately connected to the fiction of Lord of the Rings, the named characters are crucially important, not only to the execution of your strategy, but just to even winning a combat, through the rerolls they provide. So that brings so much interest to this game and dynamism, where you're trying to get the right character to the right spot because they can provide a reroll. There's a card you can use. We'll get into that. But there's this whole other element of personality that exists within this game, where a lot of grand strategy games tend to be about like, how much wheat do I have? How many thousands of guys do I have? This is about people too. You'll know where Aragorn is, where Legolas is, specifically where Frodo is, and that's going to matter. And you'll make choices in the game based on that. Something to bring up, in addition to the SPI version, is that this game is made by some real Tolkien heads.
Oh, yeah.
So it's made by Roberto Di Meglio, Marco Maggi, and Francesco Nepitello. Probably got all that wrong, so pardon me for my Western pronunciation of that. But those designers have made other Lord of the Rings games. The One Ring role-playing game, a personal favorite of mine as well. So these designers really understand the source material, and they really go in on using like specific lines from the book to inform their decisions in the game. So it doesn't just they don't just make assumptions based on the way that things might be expected to work, or historically it might have behaved like this. It's like, no, there's a line within Lord of the Rings that will specifically relate, like how the rule book starts is there's an excerpt right at the very front. Like, because if you think of War of the Ring, you tend to think of everything in the south, like, oh, Gondor did it, and they fought Mordor. But there's an excerpt right here that's from Fellowship of the Ring that says, under the boughs of Mirkwood, there was deadly strife of elves and men and fell beasts. The lands of the Bjornings were aflame. A cloud was over Moria. So there's this stuff taken from the Fellowship of the Ring that is, just to give you the reference, Book 11, Chapter 10.
Right. It's got Bible verses in it, basically, but it's Lord of the Rings.
No, that's exactly right. And that is like plugging into why they've made the choices. So why can you have a fight in the north in this game? Well, because there's specifically that, to borrow the term, verse from Fellowship of the Ring that implies, right, that there was things happening in the north, not just what the books depict in the south.
Right, yeah. So it's definitely it's a very diligently made, fan-driven product.
Oh, yeah, it really is. Like, the guys who made it have an understanding and a love for the source material that really pays out. This game had a first edition in the earlier thousands with the War of the Ring. And its main appeal when it came out was that it was, like, relative to the SPI game, a more thematic conversion, right? And then it was really popular when it first came out. It was kind of hard to get for a while. There was, pardon me, a deluxe edition that was released. And what that had was pre-painted figures. So you could have your little models, but they came pre-painted, and it wasn't like crazy, but it was quite nice. It was quite a nice set. So that was kind of one of the famous, like, oh, if you wanted to burn some cash and buy a board game, that was the way to do it, right? But Kickstarter says, of course, change the name of how much a board game can cost. Mm-hmm. So it's not quite as outlandish nowadays to throw a whack load of money at a board game for some.
Right. Yeah,
but in this instance, that was like a big deal then. And now in the second edition that came out in 2012, we are getting expansions to the game. So there's been 3 core expansions. There's been Lords, Warriors, and Kings of Middle-earth that have all come to this game to add additional units, cards, ways to interact with the rules. And now there is another deluxe big old box coming. I don't know all the details on it, but they're doing it again. They're doing another, like, everything included, all expansions in, painted models, like bespoke, heavy box. So it's going to be really fancy and nice. But, that's just a fun little note there. But the second edition did have changes to some character abilities and event cards. So, like, the Ents changed. So that was revised. I never played the first edition, but there were a few things that were smoothed over when we went over to the second edition.
Some errata was kind of included, yeah.
Yeah, you got it. Exactly. So I really like the game. I've played it several times. I've managed to win as both sides, but I've also managed to lose several times as both sides. So I can tell you that there's like, I actually have not won with a fellowship touchdown. I have won militarily as the free people.
Oh, okay.
So I just went war game on it because
so like you too.
Yeah. What else would I do? But it's a really satisfying game. And to talk about the material or the layout of the game, I'd love for you to dive in on that.
For sure, yeah. So you get a fair bit in this box. Just speaking of the manual itself, it's, nice, clean serif font, modern layout. It's balanced. It's not hard to read, like, say, an older product. I have the old SPI rule book, and I'm like, 3 columns, no.
Yeah, 3 columns, super dense, like size 10 font. It's crazy.
Yeah, this is 2 column. The columns are partitioned weirdly with they have a dividing line in them, which I don't know if it's compositionally. It makes it feel a little tight, but honestly, you hardly notice it, and it keeps things organized. Sure, I'll say that.
Yeah, I know what you mean. I do that. Just that center line. It's kind of like the fold almost, but it's not.
Yeah, and then there's a nice use of headers, good looking art that's littered throughout the book. Actually, who's the artist on this
It
one?
was a team of artists, but a famous Tolkien artist, Jim Howe, is one of the key guys. So if you're familiar with his work, then you'll see a lot of that on the card art in this game.
Yeah, it's really good looking stuff, especially on the cards. Yeah, and then inside you get like a whole bunch of stuff. You get player aids. Obviously, you get a nice big game board that will become the focus. It's a territory control board. Several different army types and hero types, so you get some nicely sculpted miniatures out of it.
Yeah, they're soft plastic, but a lot of board game components are. So it's like,
Yeah,
there you go. They have bendy spears. That's it. That's my complaint.
it's probably more for the sake of durability, and it wouldn't take well to painting because you typically want to get like some kind of hard plastic or at least semi hard plastic.
What I've seen done is people use like kind of like a varnishy spray that you do on these models first, so that the paint takes to like it's not like just a primer that you would apply. Like, we apply a lot of primers before our paint, obviously,
Sure,
but
sure.
it was like another coating that they did so that the paint didn't chip if the thing's bent. With like the spear tips and things. So I don't know what that was. But I've seen people paint this components or these components, and it's cool. You get really neat stuff. Like you get, let's take a look at the box. So you get dwarves, elves, some Gondorians, some Rohirrim. The North gets represented if you want some bardings in there. There are, of course, Isengard, and you get the Southrons, the Easterlings, and then Sauron's forces, which are like make up like half the things in the box, basically.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and that's an interesting balance point that I noticed that you also mentioned, which was that so the Fellowship's got their touchdown hit
Yep.
that will end off the game, but with the forces of light, for the lack of a better term, they have limited resources to an extent. They have to rally armies and use cards to bring on new units. But when something gets wiped out, it's wiped out. The shadow forces basically have infinite guys, so they do have a sort of fixed starting point. They can just keep cranking them out.
It's really interesting, that tension between the two factions, in that one can take risks, the other can't. Because you can lose guys on the shadow side and you'll just recover them. Whereas on this Forces of Light, you just don't have that. And it'll really change your strategy. And in the way that combat works, where there's both a combat phase, or a combat type of combat, I should clarify, and a siege type of combat, you really see the reliance on that siege mechanic for the free peoples, because they need to hide behind the walls because they don't have a lot of guys.
And then on top of that, it comes with a lot of counters. It has a 96 event card deck and a few little extra cards that are thrown in there for reference. Yeah, there's the Gollum card.
Yeah, exactly.
Explain the Gollum card.
Okay, so Gollum is the guide of the Fellowship if all other companions have left or are no longer part of the Fellowship. And then Gollum allows the Free People's player to move the Fellowship and make progress towards Mount Doom, even without other companions. And because of he can betray, yes, because shadow cards, the precious is lost. That's what it is. It's the other cards that can trigger off of Gollum, right? So if you have Gollum in the Fellowship, he can still guide them. And he can only guide them if everyone else is left. So that's a mechanic to briefly mention here before we get further into things, is you do have a Fellowship, and you actually have some compositional authorship when it comes to who's leading, who's in the Fellowship. But at the end of the day, if you get on down to just the two guys, Frodo and Sam, you can have Gollum lead them. But there are shadow cards, event cards, that can be played to manipulate that and cause, we'll call it, wrinkles in your plans.
Yeah, well, that was a thing that I noticed throughout the rules, is that the cards have either dual uses or double-edged effects.
Yeah, 100%.
So, like, one good example of this is that the Light Forces cards, they have generally two functions. One that can be used on the Fellowship to kind of move the plot along and get the hub its moving toward the target, or they can be used in a more like war game strategy buff.
Yeah.
So you can improve on something that's going on in one of your battles.
Yeah, like think of the card as like kind of chopped in half with your strategic narrative effect, like where you can move someone in a way that matches their maneuver in the book. Like a classic one is if Aragorn is in space in Rohan, he can do the paths of the dead, pardon me, and like get the army of the dead and hook around and then appear in Gondor. And there's like a whole sweeping motion you can achieve with the playing of a card. But it is very dependent on Aragorn standing in a certain place in Rohan and you having a certain context of events happening in Gondor. And with that, you can bang, move Aragorn, move the people with him, pick up some soldiers, and show up right where you need them. So it's really cool. But if you don't have that context on that card, like say you just see that Aragorn's never going to arrive there or what have you, the bottom of that card is going to be a combat ability, which will allow you to play, you know, like for rerolls or to change the damage you do or something like that. So it's really cool how that works. And you're absolutely right. Like cards are double-sided, kind of like if you want to think of a card-driven war game like a CDG from GMT, you know, the way that their strategic games work. Those typically have like a sort of a historical narrative effect, and then you play the card for ops, like you play for points to maneuver stuff. In this, you either play it for narrative effect or for combat effect, but there is still that similar card-driven war game idea to this. But to take it all to the top, this is a 2 to 4 player game. It's a 2-player game. You know, it is.
I'm actually, how does the 4-player aspect actually, like, how would you organize that?
So it's the way that you divide the faction.
Okay, right. Because even though there's a light side and a shadow side, there's divisions within that, as we mentioned before, because you have Rohan in the north and Gondor, elves, dwarves, etc. But then you also have Sauron, Isengard.
You're exactly right.
And yeah, the Easterlings.
So how that would work is it's Gondor and Rohan as player 1. Player 2 is elves, dwarves in the north, which to me is kind of weird because you definitely have a player 1 there. Like player 2 is definitely the sideshow in that free people's division. And then for the shadow players, the division is Sauron is one guy. So one guy will be Mordor, one player. And then the other player would be Isengard and the evil humans, the evil men, the Southrons and Easterlings. So it's like...
Right. You're sidekicking it, basically.
You really are sidekicking it, which I think is fine. But it is more... I've never played it that way. I've always played it head-to-head, and I've really enjoyed that.
Yeah.
Because you know what it feels like? If you play 2-player, the light side, you're Gandalf. The dark side, you're Sauron. And you're doing that strategic duel between those minds behind it all.
Yeah.
And if you add the other players, it's like, is the second guy Elrond? Is the second guy Sauron? Like, maybe.
Yeah. Who is the actual other player?
Exactly.
What boots are they filling? And yeah, I think that's a bit more vague. Again, I think it's probably more for accessibility that they made it up to 4, and it's certainly no problem on the game because there's enough pieces to organize it like that. But I agree, it definitely feels more like a 2-player head-to-head.
The way the game is like a head-to-head game is it is like a war game in many sense. Like I can destroy your armies and conquer your lands as even the free peoples. And as the shadow player, like that's the whole thing you're doing. Mm. But as we've mentioned, the One Ring, you got to deal with that. So the shadow player can effectively win by getting the ring and causing the corruption of the ring bearer, while the free people can get the ring to Mount Doom, go through the 5 steps of Mount Doom, and drop it in the fire. And if you can do that, you win.
Right.
So it adds attention to the basic war game in that you have these event cards that you want to use to maneuver your armies, and you want to use them to maximize. Like you basically want to use your action dice, which we'll talk about, and your event cards to really be like a general, you know, to be like King Elisar, move your dudes around.
Yeah.
But the problem is that if you just do that only, you've left Frodo to languish, and maybe Frodo gets ambushed by the Nazgul. What if the Ringwraiths catch him?
Well, that's the other thing, is that even the Fellowship is sort of a double-edged strategy, because if you don't attend to their progress, at least somewhat, they become a huge target, and now you could lose because the ring might be recovered.
100%. I find the Fellowship part of the game the hard part of the game. Both, like, rules-wise, it's a little more complicated, but understanding the most efficient or most, like, you are being deceptive with the Fellowship. So it is, how do I move most efficiently, but most cloak and dagger, I guess, for lack of a better term, to get to Mordor without following this easily guessed, route that the shadow player can intercept. So there's lots of these interesting wrinkles that it brings to the game. And I'm a big fan of the pressure that it puts on the war game to make you balance your resources across the two, because you get action dice. That's the primary, what's one of the primary, like, turn by turn resources of the game is your actions as dictated by these action dice. And they are what allow you to move armies and recruit stuff and play your cards. These are really cool bespoke D6. So they look really nice, and they're like these fancy, cool looking dice. I'm just trying to bring up a picture so I can take a look at them. Yeah, you get 6 and 10 according to the rulebook. That's about what it looks like in my box here. And then you get regular D6s as well for rolling combat dice. But these special dice have different faces on them. So when you roll your die, you might get the event card, so you can draw an event card. You might get the muster action, so you can deploy a new unit. If you get the army action, you're able to move an army, or the character action allows you to move a character or a character and an army if your army is led by a character. So there's a lot of cool little things. You can also get the Will of the West special action, which is the Gandalf rune. So you can get that, or you can get the eye, the evil eye.
Oh, yeah.
Symbol for the special actions. I always hear Dio singing when I hear the eye. You know what I mean? But anyways,
That's on point. I get you.
You get it. So, but that's kind of how the dice work. And you roll your fistful of dice at the start of the turn. You get and lose dice based on characters in the game. And like Gandalf the White will give you a bonus die.
Mm-hmm.
So your pool of dice will go up and down, but that's also something that kind of rings like a war game to me in kind of a fun way. Because like there are a lot of war games where you roll a hand of dice that will then enable you to do things, right? Like Chain of Command, Saga, a couple games out there. And it's kind of fun that this game has you roll your handful of special symbol dice, then you're using that economy of actions in the turn to best maneuver your forces and keep the Fellowship on path. And then the event cards, like we've gone into a few times, those will be your secret sauce to do the really cool things.
Yeah. I mean, that's one of the things that I really liked about the way this game presented itself, is that it put a lot of the random element, and this is a thing that I generally feel about strategy games, is that it puts the random element as random options rather than random outcomes.
Yes, that's a good point.
Yeah, I mean, there are random outcomes, obviously. There's regular dice that you're rolling to see how those forces come out. And random outcomes obviously have their place in games. Like most role-playing games are based on that. But strategy games, there's always a tension there with the randomness. Because some people want strategy games to be like chess, and then there's the more narrative point of view where it's like, well, you're not in control of everything. So playing with intentional movement and then random options. So that's something that the pictorial dice in this game, or as you were making the reference, chain of commands, like command dice.
Yeah.
They give you something that's not exactly, or in also the cards, in fact, the event cards. It's like they give you a limited range of things, but ones that you can actually choose from. And then you can wager the outcome randomness by the forces on the table.
Yeah, exactly. That's a really good point.
Yeah, from like a design point of view, I think that's a wise decision, especially for strategy games. Other games, I think, can get away with random outcome more easily, especially because they're not necessarily as tactical. There's other ways of doing that, but yeah, having fixed choice, random option, or random outcome, and balancing those is a lot of what makes a good strategy game.
100%. And thinking about those as you also think about the victory conditions and like the reason why you're making any of these choices, right? Because you don't want to create a game where you have victory conditions and then the path to achieving them is spaghetti, right? It's just like, well, I hope that I have the outcomes that favorably align to give me my victory condition. It's cool that in this game, like you can win through battle or you can win through the ring, but you always are given these moments of decision to apply what limited resources you have to whatever of those goals you are closer to achieving. So it always feels like you're still in the driver's seat, even when you have less of what you want. Like you won't ever get bolt actioned where it's like, well, I didn't draw my color of dice for 8 times in a row and my army got shot to hell. You don't, that doesn't happen.
Yeah, yeah.
So it's cool the way that it rolls. And I think the differences in how you achieve the victory conditions is a big part of the replayability of this game too. Like not only is it fun to play as the light side to the shadow side, or is it fun to try and get a military to a fellowship victory, it's all the permutations of events that can lead to those that are really satisfying too, just based on all these like the random chances of your choices that are presented to you.
It's an interesting blend of elements that, like, you know, if you were used to playing something like, I mean, Risk is probably the most accessible example I could give,
Okay.
but there's definitely other games that are probably better examples, like Access and Allies.
Yeah.
But again, those are more like army-focused games. This adds that extra element, that extra heat about having these story victories that have that, as I said, you kind of mentioned as sort of cloak and dagger, sort of working around the sidelines.
Yep. 100%.
And it means that even though from a military point of view, the shadow forces have an advantage in the sense that they essentially have unlimited resources, there's always that tension that they have to be like, oh, well, I got to remember from time to time, I got to try and corrupt the ring bearers, right?
Yeah, exactly. Because you can't simply play one half of the game. I mean, you can try, and there is paths to victory to doing that, but it's way not just easier, but it's also more rewarding to play the game in the capacity where you're playing both sides of it, right? You're pursuing the ring bearer, you're applying corruption, you have the Nazgul flying over the valleys of Middle Earth, right? Like doing that this game makes that an enjoyable part of your strategy in addition to trying to knock over the walls of Osgiliath, you know?
You're definitely more of the Tolkienite between the two of us. So, like, how do you feel that this maps and thematically enriches the actual lore and the setting?
So there's like 2 ways that I like to think about it. The first way is like it's all the building blocks of the story, like removed of their context in a way and put onto event cards so that all of Lord of the Rings can happen, but what order does it happen in and in what capacity does it happen in? Like, there's a World War II game, just to make a brief diversion, called Cataclysm by GMT Games. It's a really cool grand strategy game. And it's different than most World War II games because it starts in 1933. So you don't just play World War II, you play your World War II, wherein the inciting incident of that global conflict can be entirely different because you start the war so early in 33, right? In War of the Ring, it's not quite the same in that you start earlier per se. It doesn't quite have that, though there is a variant rule for starting with a different starting positions based on your playthrough of the sister game Battle of the Five Armies. We'll get into that in another conversation probably. But this game is another conceptually similar experience to Cataclysm in that it is not just the War of the Ring, it is your War of the Ring. So you'll still have the components that are thematically appropriate to the War of the Rings, to Lord of the Rings, the trilogy. However, it's not going to go the same way. It's going to be a really unique, different experience. And it's not going to, like, what's kind of cool though, is that it doesn't feel wrong. You know what I'm trying to say? Like, it feels like I had an experience where I was able to pull the Aragorn move from Rohan. So he was successful in fighting in Rohan, and then I threw him down to Gondor with the Army of the Dead, and he was successful down there. And it was totally awesome, but it was in completely wrong context for the books.
Right. Yeah. It was not canonical. Yeah.
Exactly. It was completely not canonical in terms of timing and all that. But it still happened. And it happened in a very satisfying, cool way. So it wasn't that I was playing The War of the Ring as Tolkien wrote it or envisioned it. And I wasn't playing like a super like ritualized, like, oh, it's on turn 7 that this unit is deployed now. No, it's these cards and you don't know the sequencing you're going to get. So thematically, it is very Middle Earth. It's very Tolkien, but you don't see the same through line is what I'm trying to say as you play this game. So it's really cool. Like I've even thought like, wouldn't it be fun to like role play in your version of the War of the Ring that you had? Like, what if the war was in the north this time and it was more about what happened with the Bardings and what happened at Erebor? Or if that's what counted and you could like totally play, you know, like a 5e or a one ring or whatever suits your mode for that, like kind of in your own slice that's different because of the outcome of this game. You know, like I've had a million ideas, but that is something that's kind of cool about this game is that it does give you such a different custom experience each time, like every time because of these cards.
It's weird to think about because you know you have the books and they're written in a particular way. I personally don't think of Tolkien as being a super flexible topic, like in the sense that they're written in a certain way. Maybe it's just some of the fans they have a very purist mindset. So this idea of it working out in a different way might not be everybody's to everybody's taste. If you're open minded and you don't mind the idea that there's I want to equate it to like alternate history, or that like the mindset that you go in playing like a historical war game where it's like we should probably talk about Axis and Allies because I think it's a really it's a good game, but like that game kind of tries to it tries to create the conditions that then will result in the historical result, the outcome.
Yeah, 100% it does, especially the start with the Germany and France.
Yeah, or if you're playing Japan, you're like, oh, great start. Really starts to die off quickly, and then you're kind of hooped. you think you have the advantage, which I guess is the idea, but it's like, is the game trying to demonstrate history to you? That's one mindset that I guess, at least the versions of Axis and Allies that I've played show. Or are you taking more of that free form where this is the thing as it would have been set up, but the outcome could go many different ways? And like the simplest of that is, you know, the bad guys win.
That is the simplest, like the biggest divergence, right? But like if you're sitting here as the shadow player and you're thinking like, why didn't he go for Elrond? If you would have just knocked out Rivendell, you could have sent ripples throughout the free people. Like,
right.
If you're thinking that, this is a chance to try that, right? And you'll see like, oh, there are elven warriors there, and it is a stronghold, so there's going to be problems taking that. But you could try that. That's 100% a real thing you can pursue and try and make happen. And it's like, it is like a historical game. It's just not based on anything real, but it has that same attention to detail. Like a lot of fantasy games have a penchant for like balancing around balance sake, right?
Right. Yeah.
Where here it's more around the pivotal moments of the book series and the characters and the understanding of the fiction and the literature and stuff, as opposed to what is necessarily, like, not to say this isn't balanced, like this is a thematic classic, so it's quite balanced, but it is in the sense that it's asymmetrical. And it is because of the root of the different factions in the books, like the free peoples with the elves, the dwarves, the Rohan, the Gondor, you know, the North guys. I'm sure there are hobbits hidden in there somewhere. They are all going to be these great tools for you, but it's all up to you how you're going to use them and put them into place.
Right. Yeah. I can't think of another game that does exactly that, but it really, like, because it's so based on established lore that is not also historical, there's I don't want to call it a freedom to do that, but yeah, because you're right. The asymmetry of the game is kind of what makes it interesting and dynamic, the way that the free peoples, similar to the book, not 100% sold on the whole thing, like getting involved.
Yeah, that's an interesting mechanic to bring up, actually.
And it's not something that's explicit in the book, but it definitely is present, that, like, not everybody's wanting to get all the way involved for various reasons, different factions having their own sort of inner conflicts or misgivings about the other people involved. But yeah, sorry, like the way that it goes in the game, how do you feel that that's managed?
Well, like, again, that's sort of another thing that makes this an interesting experience, in that you have to activate the free people nations, right? You don't just, it's not, again, it's a little different than the SPI game where it's like, here are your armies, move them,
yeah.
Here
it's a lot more straightforward.
Yeah, where here you have to send envoys effectively, and it creates this tension in that. I love that word, by the way. I'm going to use it a lot today. There's going to create this friction for us where, do you keep Legolas with the Fellowship because he's great to have and protect them? Or instead, do you send him back to Mirkwood to go get help? Like the elves do. I should clarify, the elves do start all on war footing, but it is something that you have to think about. Like, would Gimli or Legolas be better served as a diplomat than as a guardian for the Fellowship or as a general? There's different ways to interpret the roles of these characters, which again is kind of what I was saying, where you're not just doing what the book did, because it's not going to tell you, like, at turn 11, this is the event that will occur now. It's all based on what do you get to wear and what options are in your hand at that time. Like, the Ents can absolutely be spawned and triggered and sent into battle against Isengard, but it is the when and why can be so different.
Yeah, that's a tricky thing when you're designing a game of this nature, is you don't want it to feel fixed or meaningless, but you also want to make sure that it's paying accurate tribute to the source material.
And that's why it really feels like a historical game, and closer to like a Paths of Glory or something. Even though it's not as complicated as that, or quite as hardcore, it still has that cap on to me, as opposed to wearing the same cap as like a Rune Wars, which is a cool, super cool game. But it's like, that is like a gamey game, right? Where it's not based on anything. It's just a game that's fun. Where this has a source material that it is lovingly crafted after and trying to capture in a really meaningful way. And the narrative integration of the game, like the whole taking the content of the cards, having the journey of the Fellowship, and creating that, like, that's kind of why I mentioned earlier, like, it feels like you could role play in this, because you get a certain reality to the moves that get made, because it's not as dry as just, I can move 3 spaces, so I move 3 spaces. And it's not as like rote or fixed as like, well, on this turn, this happens, because it's like, you made it happen. You were the one that made the maneuver from Rohan down into Mordor. Like, you didn't even go help Gondor this time. You bypassed that and you go straight to cut off the forces of evil, and you had a card that allowed you to move Rohan faster, because they're all mounted, right? And so it's really cool how you can kind of you're using the historical components to do your own thing. And if you're a historical gamer who's played, World War I, World War II, medieval, some of these games that reenact or adapt a battle, you may be familiar with the feeling where you're like, okay, how would I solve this problem? And you're given all the same tools as your historical counterpart, so to speak, in the game capacity, all the same tools, obviously, but you're trying to like do your take on the solution. And this game does such a cool job of giving you the bits to do that meaningfully, like whether you have the elves and the dwarves, or you're doing it with the Fellowship, Or conversely, if you're Shadow, if you're moving the Mouth of Sauron to lead an army, right? You're still doing like these really cool things to try and solve the question of how could you win the War of the Ring if you were Gandalf or if you were Sauron. How would you do it differently? And for me, a big question is always the North. Like when I play the Shadow, I always want to take on the North because I feel like that's such a vulnerability for the Free People's player, such a blind spot for so many people who kind of picture the War of the Ring being about Gondor, right? And then you just get them in the North and no one sees it coming.
Yeah, no, it's I mean, obviously, if people haven't guessed, I've only read through the rule book and looked at the parts and the components of it, but I'm actually pretty excited to try this out. How would you feel it would work with like parallel play? Like as you were kind of hinting at, like it might actually be able to set a tone for the role playing game, which is, I think you said, designed by the same team.
Yeah. The War of the Ring. The One Ring is the same design guys. I don't think it's everybody. I forget exactly who stayed and who left, or whatever the exact mix of designers was. But it was the same core designers of this title were on the One Ring. And there's a passage in the One Ring GM part, right, where they talk about being a lore master, and they say like, why would you role play in Lord of the Rings? Didn't Tolkien write it all out? Didn't he tell you how this worked? And like, aren't people reverent enough of this source material that you wouldn't really want to play with it, right? Like, there's that sense. But they directly address that in the Lore Master Guide for the chapters of that, pardon me, in the book of the One Ring,
Okay.
where they're like, Tolkien himself revised the work several times. He was changing things. He was in a state of flux with his own work. He was asking other authors of the time, his pen pals, what are you doing? What do you think of this? And there was a certain amount of, I mean, it was through the author this was changing, but there was a certain amount of I guess like revision and adaptability to the work that doesn't imply that it was written once in stone and then remained. Like even different publishing dates of Lord of the Rings could have had different language in the book.
Yeah, I mean, like, didn't he effectively rewrite the book multiple times wholesale, like from basically cover to cover? Because it was a personal project on his part.
Yes, and another big way he wrote it that I understand was that it was like it wasn't written in the way that a lot of authors would write today. Where there's a lot of planning and like a pre-production phase that would go into an authorship project. He didn't do that. He just like took a pen and put it on page and started to roll.
Yeah.
And it's really cool that it worked, but it's so stream of consciousness in a certain capacity.
Mm-hmm.
It's really interesting. And there's a real attention to that lore paid in this book, the way they craft everything around the statements taken from the text, like I said, but they're not afraid to let you come up with your own version of it all. You know what I mean? Like, it doesn't mean just because these guys know the material so well doesn't mean that they're going to say like, and once we're in the act 3 of this game, it's going to go like this now because, we're in Return of the King. It doesn't work like that. And I think that's one of the best strengths of this game is like for a strategy game that's based on something that isn't just like a Mighty Empires kind of like random components, make your own map kind of thing. For a game that comes with set forces and a set map, replayability is a huge question, especially if someone's asking you to pay money for it. And
for sure.
You know what I mean? They're like, you don't want a one-shot experience for the most part.
I mean, the publisher might only care that you play it once, but as a selling point for someone that enjoys board games and the like, especially these kinds of more complex strategy games, I might not buy it if it doesn't have that level of flexibility and replayability.
And they achieve that here. Like, there's big replayability in the course of the variability of play. I still like the two criticisms I have are the bendy spears, that's a joke criticism. It's not real. But the other thing is I do think it's a 2-player game. I don't think it's a 4-player game.
It seems more of a concession to have more players in this just because like, oh, well, I want to play with more people. I want to make it more of a group activity. and less of this competitive head-to-head thing, even though it really doesn't change that.
Yeah,
Instead of 1v1, it's 2v2.
exactly. And you do have to share some resources too. Like it's just not exactly the way the game's intended to play based on my reading. I take away that one of us is Gandalf, one of us is Sauron. It's the old rivalry, right? These two guys who have for thousands of years strategically been pitted against each other. Like, playing this game. What is the line? The board is set. The pieces are moving. You know what I mean? That is this game. And it captures that so well. I feel bad that my copy's getting beat up. I'm like, do I need another copy of this game? My copy's getting beat up now, But like, I haven't played it enough to justify that. But it just, when you move around a few times in a couple of years, like, some things get bashed about. It's kind of like, just like that.
Oh no, yeah. I mean, again, I just went through that process, and I'm just like, oh man, I'm scared to open boxes because I'm like, geez.
I know exactly what you mean. So, yeah, but I would say, like, if you're a Tolkien fan or you're a fantasy wargamer, there's not a reason to delay on this game because it's going to do the Tolkien stuff for you. Like, it does it. It's Jim Howe artwork. It is the characters. It's the map. It's got so much that is so evocative of that fiction, right? But then that's a really cracking good war game.
Yeah.
Or thematic board game, if you want to have the BGG terminology for it. It's a game of war. Like, you're fighting battles and you're besieging stuff and you're mustering armies. So even if it's not quite so hex and countery as the original namesake of this game was, it's still a part of it. And if you're not a big battlehead, if you're more of like a Euro gamer, maybe this game won't be as appealing, and maybe you'll be curious about the War of the Ring card game. Same designers again, but it's like effectively taking this game and taking away the board and making it just the event cards. And like, that would be fun for a different audience who want the same thematic experience, but they don't want to play like more of a battle-y game. Just do that. But if you want the territory control, the maneuver, not like intricate maneuver, but still, right? Like, do I go around the gap of Rohan or not? Like, these are questions you're going to be asking. And I think that's just really satisfying. It's super fun. The expansions are not essential, I would say. Their availability can be harder to find than the base game. So you don't need to feel like some games, if you don't get the expansions, you're not playing the game right. I wouldn't say that's true here.
Yeah, I hate that.
I totally agree. Like, I would not say that's true of War of the Ring. Like, the base box of this game that you can get for $70 to $100, depending on your currency. I mean, it's going to give you multiple playthroughs. You get a ton of wargaming components. Like, even if you're not a war gamer, you're more of a board game guy, but you're still attracted to maybe playing skirmish games, the miniatures in this can even be used for that. I've even seen people play Song of Blade and Heroes using the components of this game. So there's even like fun little aside things to this kit. Like, just the value of this box in itself goes beyond simply this specific game, in that you just get a ton of cool components.
Yeah, no, I mean, having expansions that I think add freshness and more replayability that the base game already has. I mean, I think that's what, if not should be designed, that's what a consumer should keep an eye out for.
100%. Like, the 3 expansions, they add Lords of Middle-earth is going to add like Galadriel and some of the other like more non-combatant characters.
Right, yeah.
Warriors of Middle-earth adds like the Corsairs of Umbar and like sort of the less prominent belligerents, but the ones who were still there. And then Kings of Middle-earth is the one that I just got, and I haven't engaged with it yet. I haven't played with this one. But what it does is it adds more leaders and more tension to, there we go again, to...
it's tense.
Exactly. To turning on the factions, the nations into war footing. It makes that a little bit more of an involved process, because you're going to have the king under the mountain in Erebor now as a guy. And it's not just like, oh, the dwarves are the dwarves are the dwarves, and you go slap the dwarves to turn them on. It's like there's more of a process now, which I'm really curious about because I'm a big dwarf fan. Dwarfs are probably my favorite of the fantasy peoples. So I love to see a little bit more attention paid to them in this game, And that is sort of why this is another really cool title for Lord of the Rings fans is like if you felt like you didn't get enough elves and dwarves in Lord of the Rings compared to The Hobbit, for example, well, you can make them bigger deal in this game if you want. You can put more.
Yeah, you get your fill.
Yeah, 100%. I had a question for you though. When it comes to a game that is so rooted in like a setting or something, what do you look for? Because like it's not that you're not a Tolkien guy per se, but you're not like I'm drawn first to the setting. When you look at a game like this, what draws you to it?
Probably the way that it's laid out as a strategy game. Because you're right, like I have nothing personally against Lord of the Rings. It's just, other settings and ideas speak to me a bit more. I still have like absolute respect. I've read through the books and I get what they're about. But for me, I think it's being convinced that it's a flexible game, that it's not being overly adherent, but still feels like that thing.
Yes.
I know it's like it's a very weird balance there. And again, it's something that like if I just look at it, I don't know. So I really rely on someone like you who's got that immediate fandom association with the world and the property, going out and buying it on those terms, and then telling me why it's also good as just a strategy board game. Because it's that whole like, people are like, oh, don't buy early access, but then like, yeah, but somebody will, and then I'll know.
Exactly.
I equate it to like the way that penguins will all like push each other in a crowd toward the edge of the water, and then eventually someone will go in and maybe there's a killer whale that'll pop up and take them out. Maybe it's safe. And, and that might be a cynical thing. I certainly have things that I am a fan of that I will probably go out and get despite the naysaying or the hesitation.
Right.
But no, I think it's important that somebody get and play the game, and probably makes sense that it's somebody that wants to get it based on the association with the property itself.
For me, like when I used to work at a board game store when the second edition came out. So it hit our shelves, right? And I was like, oh, I'm gonna grab this. This looks great. And then because I was a Lord of the Rings fan, and I saw War of the Ring. This is great. I'm super into this. But playing it, I got my friend who is a Lord of the Rings fan. He loves the movies. Never read the books though. But got him to play with me, and he was blown away by the depth of the game and really got sucked into it. And that was really rewarding for me because I thought I was having to sell the game. Like, oh, no. It's cool. Trust me. No. You want to play it. But he was like, no, this is awesome. Like, I can't believe this card did this. And I can't believe I lost this guy, but then I did this. Like it created a lot of intent and enjoyment in its own right, not just because you recognize the names and faces.
Yeah. Well, I mean, when we have a moment, I'd love to actually play it.
Yeah, we should do a base game play, just like the core game, because it's only like 2.5 hours if you play the base game. Like it's pretty. Okay. It's not a big deal.
Yeah, no, I think it's intriguing, and I think that there's like I've seen. Like, you're not the first person to pique my interest in this based on the dynamics of it. I remember seeing like I think it was a sit down and shut up review of the game. But their reviews, while definitely good, like in depth, they are from like 1,000 feet up. So you're kind of selling me on this in the sense that I'm getting, not only do I know the more of the detail of it, but I have a trust of your opinion of games in general. Like you and I tend to like the same things, at least mechanically.
Right. So. Yeah, exactly. And there's like, to appeal to your like crunchy sensibility a little bit, it's not like there's not like, for example, just to give a really high level overview of combat, like you have regular troops and elite troops. Elite troops are good for 2 dice. Regular troops are good for 1 dice. Troops have 1 HP effectively. They're destroyed when they take damage. Elite troops, however, take a step loss and they just convert from elite to regular. And that's basically as complicated as that works. But now you've got the cards. And like we said earlier, you can play them with the combat. And then you have characters, which will enable rerolls on your dice. So this crunch doesn't exist on the page, but it exists in the interactions between the different components in the moment of gameplay. When the context is applied and all the different things are aligned, then it's crunchy in a way that doesn't feel overwhelming. And I love that. I think it's such a good balance point for a strategy game. Like Twilight Imperium is super cool, and I actually have had like some real fun with it. But it has a certain like intimidation factor that this game completely skirts around.
Oh, okay.
And I think that is just hats off to the guys for their design on War of the Ring. And it's one of my favorite strategy board games I've ever played.
One thing that I think I just sort of realized as well that answers your question as to what appeals to this about me, or appeals about this game to me, is I come to strategy games from role-playing games. And so the fact that there are significant characters allows me to kind of settle into that idea of playing someone of note that a story can be told through.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that, and I think that is like one of the main unique selling points of this game. So like, I think that would effectively be my answer if like not taken through just your recommendation.
That's really cool. No, I think that's great. And I would say like, if you're on the fence about this and you're not a Lord of the Rings guy, we might not be able to convince you. But if you are someone who's a big strategy head and you haven't tried this, there's a real appeal to the way all the parts fit together just so here. So I give it a really good recommendation. It's in my rotation of board games I always like to try and get out every year. And my next big board game is going to be like way more invested because I'm going into Battle of Normandy with Darren. So that's going to be like the craziest game. But for a game that I could play in one day and have a lot of fun with, this is it.
All right. Well, that is our take on War of the Ring, 2nd edition. And I'm certainly excited to give it a shot. I hope you all are too. Yeah.
I think you'll really like it. And we'll be back next week. We're going to do a Beyond the Book, and it'll be an interesting one because we're going to talk about the concept of adaptation.
Yeah, more generally. Yeah, definitely inspired by this.
That's basically what this is.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? Like this is, it's bigger than licenses. It's more like adapting material that can include anything from historical to television settings. So we'll go through that and just kind of give our thoughts as we proceed. But thanks so much for tuning in and listening with us, and otherwise have an awesome rest of your day.
Yeah. Happy gaming.
We hope you enjoyed delving into today's episode. A big thanks to all of you out there for joining us. If you want to continue the conversation, you can find us on Instagram and YouTube at Tales and Tactics Podcast, or on all popular podcast platforms. Join us again on the next exciting episode of Tales and Tactics.